Well, good evening, everybody, and you're very welcome to this week's Thinking About session. My name is Colm Ó Siochrú. I'm the head of history at Dulwich College, and it's my great pleasure and our great pleasure to welcome Alex Renton tonight. Alex is an award-winning and campaigning journalist on a whole range of issues, from poverty and development to the environment, and not least, of course, to the topic that he's going to be addressing tonight, which is his most recent book, Blood Legacy: Reckoning with a Family's Story of Slavery. It's a powerful, evocative, and densely researched and very stylishly written piece of history, really, that sits at the intersection of historical work, I would say cultural criticism and memory, and also political argument. Alex's book has been longlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize, and it's received very warm praise in the press. Alex was due to speak to us in person during Black History Month, which unfortunately we had to abandon for COVID reasons, but all the better in the sense that he's able to join us here tonight online and be able to address a much bigger audience. So we're really grateful, Alex, that you've been able to do that. Having been on our radar for over a month, lots of students have had the opportunity to read your book or chunks thereof, and it became the subject of a really stimulating discussion that we had here about a range of burning questions about the blood legacy, as you put it, of the British Empire and British imperialism, of Western capitalism more broadly. I think also about ways of reckoning with and making reparations for the past and the legacy of the past that exists in our present. Alex also recently appeared on the Channel 4 documentary, The Empire State of Mind, which I would really recommend, not least because it highlights again, very eloquently, many of the questions that Alex poses. And these are, of course, the questions that to a great extent are shaping our cultural and political agenda today. So it's wonderful then to have so passionate and persuasive contributor to those discussions in our midst this evening. Alex is going to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. We'll then have time for questions, which will be led and moderated by two of the history students here at DC. But all the rest of you are very welcome, and we certainly encourage you to enter your questions during and for the Q&A session at the end, and we'll pick out and get through as many of those as we can. And Alex has made a special appeal to make those questions as honest or as difficult as you would like them to be. He won't finish unless he gets started, and that means I need to stop talking. So without further ado, I will pass over to Alex Renton and his lovely little dog somewhere in the background.
Yeah, the Ziggy, my Jack Russell, is wandering around somewhere, but she'll bark if she's not in here. Thank you, Colm, and good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for your interest. I thought I'd start by just reading a couple of paragraphs from my book, the first two of the introduction, because they kind of just explain who I am and where I'm coming from to this subject. So there's a quote at the top which goes, "It is a privilege to learn about racism instead of experiencing it your whole life." A sign at a Black Lives Matter rally in June 2020. I am an heir of Britain's slavery past. It marks my mind, my culture, my DNA. I am a descendant of the owners of enslaved people and of an enslaved African woman, of a campaigner for the abolition of slavery and of people who traded in African people from Africa to the Caribbean. Like me, the Britain in which I grew up is a place shaped in no small way by transatlantic and plantation slavery and the many industries that thrived on them. I am a part of the legacy that lives on economically and culturally, visible not just in grand houses and old statues, but in the systemic and street level racism that afflicts our country today. Like most of us, I am a mess of differing inheritances, but the person I present to the world is pretty much the one formed by the wealthy people of my ancestry. As a white middle-class Briton, I am so shielded from everyday racism that I rarely notice it. While most of the wealth my ancestors accrued was long ago spent, the privilege garnered from it still protects and supports me. The history of Britain and slavery, worked and glossed by white people to make it distant and irrelevant is the foundation of my comfortable liberal life. So this story starts in the basement of an old, slightly decrepit house in Ayrshire in Scotland, which is where my mother's parents, my grandparents lived, and we used to go for our family holidays, Christmas and things. And my grandfather was a historian, and the family had lived in this house for 500 years, and their fortunes had risen and fallen, but they had been members of parliament and generals and admirals and governor generals of places in India and elsewhere in the colonies, New Zealand. And my grandfather's hobby was putting all these papers in order. And, that's kind of how I remember him. He would, sit in this room full of cigarette smoke, just sort of scrawling on these ancient yellow sheets, and occasionally come out and play with us, but his grandchildren. But so 5 years ago, I was down in the cellar, which is sort of full of pigeon droppings, just looking through the papers and his catalogues that he wrote. And I kept the words Tobago and Jamaica kept coming up. And I said to my mother, "What's this about?" And she went, yes, maybe a bit embarrassing. And my father did tell me that we were involved in slavery, like everyone else, he said, which I suppose meant the other old families with land around this part of rural Scotland, and that we hadn't made much money, and that it hadn't gone on for very long. And of course, as an investigative journalist, and a descendant of these people who I was brought up to admire, I had to look. So I spent a year or more going through masses and masses of ancient papers, and they're now all transcribed and photographed. And indeed, if anyone wants to see them, I'll send them the link to them. But because I don't see why I should have them loaned to myself, or they belong to everybody. And as I started to read, I got very, appalled, horrified immediately. But there's something very interesting that happened quite early on. So my ancestors started investing in land and enslaved people, if you can put it that way, in Jamaica and Tobago in the 1760s, 1770s. And they sent a man called Jamie, my 6 times great uncle, out to Tobago, literally to buy 300 acres of plantation in northeast Tobago. Jungle, actually. It was untreated, uncultured land, and 70 African people to chop down the trees and start making it into a plantation. So great 6 times great uncle Jamie writes back to his brothers who funded the trip in the house where I was sitting reading this stuff. And the awful thing was that very quickly I realized that he wasn't someone from another age, or he was someone quite like me. I mean, he was brought up a Christian, and he had kind of the education I'd had and the values and beliefs that I've grown up with as a modern person. And he clearly wasn't just a monster with a whip out of a Quentin Tarantino movie. He was someone that you needed to address as, with appalling, horrific flaws. He made an appalling moral mistake, but also I understood him. I felt I could talk to him. So that seemed to me really important to start to talk about, that the people who did this act of genocide against Africans for greed and profit were people like ours, permitted to do so by a government not very unlike ours as well. Democracy was emerging. It was done for trade and for capitalism. So as I read further in the letters, I got to this became more intriguing. You found myself looking for good things in the letters, because I suddenly felt ownership of these people. And so there were passages appeared in, Jamie would write sometimes quite moving letters about how frightened he was, how lonely he was, right out on the edge of the world, about working side by side with the African people. He was the only white man there, and he was the doctor as well. And he'd talk about how they spoke with each other and got on with them. And his brother writes back at one stage going, I'm very pleased. It's another Christian man. I'm very pleased to hear that you are treating these poor people with humanity. That's what I would expect of you as a decent man, and surely it's better if they're treated well than treated brutally. I mean, you may argue that that fact of stealing them from Africa and taking away their names and any rights at all was brutal in the first place. But you kind of go, this is interesting, because you list them in your, I've got all these sheets of inventories of the plantation. You list them alongside the farm animals, and you treat them like farm animals, but you see them as human beings. So how can you do this? Because you couldn't do this to a white person. It's already illegal back in Britain. And then actually the next letter from that one with the humanity remark in it, my great uncle, who's 26 years old, writes to his older brother, and in the letter with lots of news and trying to borrow more money, and the news that he's, for the first day, they've got some jungle cleared and they planted cotton, the first crop. And he has a design that he draws into the letter, and they're of the letters AF and JF intertwined. So this is their initials. And he says, if you'll do me the honor, because you're now a partner in the plantation, I will have this made into metal in Barbados, and it's the brand we will use to mark the 10 new Africans I've just bought. So this man of Christianity and humanity is also prepared to put a burning red hot iron into humans' skin. And it wasn't legally required. It's just what you did to your property. And there's far worse. I mean, there's much worse, but that really struck me. There's something very intimate about that. I mean, what's far worse, and that becomes apparent in the letters from the much bigger plantation in Jamaica. And I don't know if anyone knows Jamaica, in St. Thomas Parish, very near Morant Bay, where it's very clear that the human beings are farm animals. And that becomes clear by the way, I mean, they're talked of in the many letters home between the managers, the Scottish managers in Jamaica and my ancestors back at home, in the way they're spoken about and in the way they're treated. Because at this point in the 1770s, the price of an adult male African at the Kingston harbour, where the slave market was, is about 60, 70 pounds. Now that translates to an expensive car. I mean, at the top of the range Volvo today, it's a lot of money, but it's still so huge are the profits we made from sugar. It's still cheaper to work these people to death and replace them with new ones from Africa. And this is what they do to the mules as well. They just work them till they're dead and they get another one. And it's that casual brutality hits very hard to the descendant of these people who I now feel in touch with. It's very hard indeed that, I mean, I'm not the one who suffered, and nor are my ancestors. 1,000 people, I reckon, went through their plantations in the end, and all of their, I know what my ancestors were doing in May 1774. None of the descendants of the people enslaved have any memorial to know what their ancestors did, and what happened to them. They only know that it was almost certainly a story of utter horror. But the moral horrors are on many levels. I meant to say, sorry. So the average lifespan of an adult male arriving from Africa was only 4 years. And that gives you an idea. I mean, 3.25 million African people shipped by the British to the Americas over that period. But at the end of slavery, there's only 700,000 left. So although some children were born, that the effect overall was to decrease the population. That was what the work and the cruelty did. And Sir Adam Ferguson, this is the elder brother of Jamie, who never went to the Caribbean. He was a member of Parliament and an important figure in Edinburgh philosophical societies and rector of Glasgow University. So an Enlightenment man of the great age of the age of reason. He was immoral. He never saw a plantation, but his cruelties were at arm's length. But they were very, and I go into some of them in the book. I mean, including the arrival at his house one day of a runaway from Jamaica, from the plantation, who's managed to get himself all the way to Britain to make a complaint about their treatment. And I'm afraid that's not which is an extraordinary thing to happen, obviously, 5,000 miles. And then went back to Britain. He was not a slave, but Sir Adam persuaded him to go back to Jamaica, and presumably because this Augustus Thompson's family was still enslaved on the plantation, that's why he went. And the story does not end well. But Sir Adam, some of you would have studied the abolition of the slave trade debate and Wilberforce's speeches and so on. One of the few things I was told about when I studied history at school, because it's one of the stories the British pride themselves about. So, but Sir Adam, was a Whig MP, so he was technically on the side of Pitt and the government that first brought forward the failed abolition bill in 1792. And Sir Adam, I know from his letters, sat in Parliament listening to Wilberforce and Pitt speak in favor of the abolition of the slave trade, which didn't pass. And then he walked back to his lodgings in St. James's, about a 10-minute walk, and he sat straight down and wrote a letter to his manager, another Scot on the plantation, saying, although this bill is now defeated, it's likely that the trade of enslaved people from Africa will stop. So get out there and buy more girls while you can, more young girls to breed from, because we won't have a source in Africa and the price is bound to go up. Fantastically cynical. And again, we're back to a man who treated his, who clearly, could behave well and honorably in some people's mind. He was known for good works among the tenants of his estates in Ayrshire. He's kind to his many relatives who depended on him for money. A bit like a Jane Austen novel, his life, if you've read Jane Austen, and this story just sort of goes on and on. I mean, not to spend too long on it, but I mean, for me as a writer, what's useful is that my family owned the Jamaica plantation right through to 1875, so long after the end of slavery in the Caribbean, British slavery in the Caribbean, but through a terrible period of where what had been the richest of all the British colonies was abandoned, and the freed enslaved people abandoned too, given no land rights, not really many rights as citizens, though they were technically free, and famine and war and civil war and insurrection and brutal suppression of that follows. And so that story all becomes part of this Rozelle plantation story as well. But the key thing in the 19th century, as again, I hope you guys have been taught this, you've all been taught this in your schools, because I wasn't taught in my school, was that my ancestors and the 46,000 other slave owners had to be bought with a £20 million bribe to compensate them for giving up their enslaved people as their property. And the enslaved people got nothing at all. And this £20 million, it doesn't sound so huge in terms of government expenditure today, but it is actually equivalent to 17 billion. So that's what the NHS expenditure in a year, maybe. And it was the biggest sum of money borrowed by the British government in the entire 19th century. And it was basically a handout to some of the richest people in the empire already. And a handout, my ancestors, not totally sure how they spent it because the records aren't as good. This is my 3 times great grandfather now, But what I do know is that he was famous in Scotland again as a man of the church and a part of the government of the Scottish Church. And he is noted for having built schools for the poor fishermen of East Scotland and churches. But he didn't do a single thing, no church, no schools, not even land for the 198 people who were enslaved on his land until 1833. Nothing at all. Which brings me back to why, again, writing the book seemed important, because it became more, and again, I'm ashamed that I hadn't, as a educated, privileged white man, I hadn't clocked or learned this, but it seemed completely clear that my ancestors were racists, and it was only possible for them to enslave people because of their skin color. They could not have enslaved white people. Eventually legally in Britain, but so they had to consider the people of dark skin and originally from Africa to be some kind of less valuable human being, and as I say, and then treat them and give them the same rights as a farm animal. And that has more practical things. So after I it finished the sort of, I'm going to go on for about 3 more minutes. After I'd finished the sort of transcription of these letters and I'd worked out what the story was, the story which has been suppressed by my family, as many others have suppressed it, I said I had to go and see what people in Jamaica and Tobago felt now. And so that makes another sort of section of the book. So I went and had, I just turned up on initially on the sites where I could see from the old maps that our plantations had been, and started asking people what they thought of me and of the history and what it meant to them today. And that led to some pretty interesting conversations. I did some DNA testing as well, because I thought it was possible I might have cousins in Tobago, which would have been interesting. And I've got I did interview everybody with the surname Ferguson in Tobago and Trinidad, which led to some great conversations. And and none of you will be surprised to hear just how interested and generous people were with me, and how and pleased to have a chance to talk this through, because a lot of them said we didn't know that you would talk, people like you would talk about it. And I asked everybody, obviously, how slavery affected them today. And the thing, almost universally, and this is academics and journalists and ordinary, small farmers, everyone I met, taxi drivers, and almost everyone said colorism. Said that the fact that, I remember I interviewed the young history graduate, 22-year-old woman called Takea Lane, who was running the Scarborough, the Tobago History Museum, and I said, and she said, look, my sister is much lighter skinned than me, and from very young as I can remember, I knew that meant she had more advantage in life, and so it has proved, and I've had to make adjustments to my life because of the color of my skin, and you and Alex, it comes from you and your ancestors about how you arrange things. And it's totally true, because I can see in the documents that, because a lot of children of mixed race were born on the plantations, not least because the white men were allowed to do what they wanted. There was no control at all on how they exploited the enslaved women. And they got better jobs, because how could you you couldn't make someone with white blood work in the field, so you get to work in the house. And I, to my utter shame, had no idea that this, how ignorant was I. And so that's the story of this book. Really, it's really a story of educating myself, and having spent a lifetime as a sort of liberal journalist who took, had views on racism and considered himself not a racist and all those sort of things. And I now realize how inadequate that self I was proud of being was, and how this history has been suppressed by people like me, by my class. I mean, I went to school not unlike Dulwich College, quite expensive, but I was not taught. I couldn't have told you 5 years ago the date that slavery ended in the British colonies. I couldn't have told you that 3 million Africans were shipped by the British. I might have guessed 300,000. And this history was covered up, was denied, and quite physically, families like mine. I mean, we're not the only ones, but we sat on the history. It was kept in a cellar, as I've described. So that's really, oops, I've just whacked my laptop. That's really, that's the point really of this project. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Alex, for that really interesting but also relevant talk. And so I guess on that point, what can we do today to, I guess, change the course of the blood legacy and confront the legacy of slavery?
Great question, Tom. I mean, and I do get, what's been pleasing about doing this book is I do get asked it, and by white people who know they also have this same heritage as I do. There's also white people who say I should shut up and stop betraying the greatness of Britain's wonderful history of kindness to across the world. But I'm not sure. In a way, I'm not sure that it's my question to answer. I mean, I feel that people, my ancestors and people like me, have been in charge of this, the post-colonial, the colonial period, and then the post-colonial period, and have kind of tried to tell we've controlled the history and the facts, and then tried to tell other people what to think and what to do about it. And I think one of the things I have learned is that we've come to a time where listening is kind of the job of people like me. So how do you change the blood legacy? I'd like to hear how do we get Britain to acknowledge this history in a way that makes Britain a better place, a kinder, more tolerant, less unequal place? I mean, those are the questions. I'd kind of like to throw them back to you. I mean, you particularly you who are young, whatever your skin color, because you're going to do it. For me, it can only be about acknowledgement, about stopping the cover up. And I have a great friend out here in Scotland who is famous as Scotland's first Black professor, Sir Geoffrey Palmer, who's now head of Heriot-Watt University. And he says, you can't, to people like me, you can't change that history, but you can still change the consequences. And I think if people like me, which is the white middle class, can acknowledge that the roots of continuing racism in this country are from this history and of other places in the British Empire where racism was used as an administrative tool, as a way of controlling the masses, dividing and ruling. That's the beginning of the start to a way forward, because blame culture is a big part of what's going on in Britain around this debate at the moment. And I've heard our own Prime Minister to say that Black people should stop seeing themselves as victims. And coming from a class and a culture that made Black people, people across the empire into victims and exploited them, that was pretty rich, I think. Sorry, a long answer. And what I really wanted to say is, there are 80 people out there who I think may have better ideas than me about how to make it better.
So Alex, what do you feel the role of the historian or writer is in discussions of past slavery? And are there risks in presenting a history so personal to yourself? Because traditionally historians are told to be quite detached from history. And how did you feel it was to have to deal with your own family's history and confront that? Do you feel that was a tough thing to do?
Well, I'm not a historian. and I mean, I had arguments in my family about me doing this, not least, I mean, and I wrote this book as someone who is the descendant, first and foremost, as someone who is the descendant of people who who killed and exploited people in this way. So I think my role was perfectly clear. These papers were too important, and the history they contained too crucial for all sorts of reasons to be kept dark. So it was my job to bring them into the light. I mean, that's which is. I've got to know quite a few historians of this period through researching the book, and many have helped me, and I've used their books as well to sort of back up what I've written. And I think it's interesting. I mean, a lot of them were in. Actually, Jeremy Clarkson, who you'll all have heard of, wrote a column on the Sunday Times the other day, in which he said something completely untrue, and I think said it entirely with malice in his mind, which was that the cost of policing the slave trade after abolition, the cost to the British Navy, was bigger than the entire gain that the British people made from 250 years of enslaving people. It's quite a common denialist trope. So I got more and more cross about this, because Clarkson has many fans, and he's highly influential, and it is a lie. It's just not true, and it's told in a way to say, shut up about our history and stop, And he addressed it to teachers like yours and lefty muddleheads, he said, who hate Britain. So that means me, apparently. So I got more and more cross, and I wrote to 5 eminent economic historians saying, okay, I'm really going to go for this with the Sunday Times. I want an apology. I want it withdrawn. I want Jeremy Clarkson, slapped on the wrist. and they all wrote to me in support, but saying you can't use our names. It's too scary out there at the moment. If I stood up as professor of whatever at whichever university and started an argument with Jeremy Clarkson, I would live in fear. And that's the other side of the cancel culture thing that people on the right tell the left do. So I find I do look sort of at history. History is continually evolving. That's one thing. And history is always written by those who are in power, and those who write history need to remember that those who aren't in power need to be listened to as well, because the bias will be to those who are articulate and have the power. But I do sometimes wonder, this is another rambling answer to your question. You can see that I'm wondering about historians, but I think, for me, as a reader of history, I just want all the truth, as much truth as is possible. Surely that's the best rule.
So you touched on the reaction, I guess, that your books had in talking to academics. What was the response like, both from academics and then from the public more broadly? Did you find it I guess, receptive to your ideas, or was it more closed off than you had?
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, and very different according to class and race and age. So academics actually been really quite nice. I mean, I think, as not a historian and someone who didn't get a very good degree in university, you kind of go, you have a sort of imposter fear that they're going to look at your work and go, "This is rubbish, boy, do it again." But actually, they've been quite kind, very kind actually, and some of them have even written nice reviews of it. So the reaction, I think, I got great reviews in the liberal press, in the sort of Guardian, Financial Times, which I was sort of expected. Really nice reviews, and the Spectator, Daily Mail, Telegraph side seem to have completely ignored it. I mean, but for me, the most interesting, Satnam Sanghera, who we mentioned, wrote a really nice interview in the Times, which is online, and and they reviewed it there. And but the real shocker there was the I mean, I know we shouldn't read below the line comments. Everyone knows, don't feed the trolls. But if you write a comment in the Times, you've had to pay your subscription to do it. And the stuff that appeared there after Satnam's piece with me and the reviews of my book, which were positive, was just absolutely gobsmacking. I mean, I had no idea that, you know, Times readers, educated people from the establishment, held such angry, well, we're full of such anger, actually. And it was all about defending the story of empire that they've been taught and brought up with, the same one I was taught and brought up with. And a lot of it, you know, very articulate, very angry. And in the end, you go, what's your motive here? You actually just want people who aren't like you to shut up, don't you? I mean, you know. And I think I'm going to write something about, because I've got a 400-page Google document full of all these comments. I cut and pasted them because they're anthropologically really interesting. But they also told me that white middle-class Britain, when it can hide behind an anonymity, is far more racist in its quite sophisticated way than I had guessed. And I was shocked, appalled by that. I've got, you know, I don't have that much abuse directly at me, but then I'm not a writer of color. All the writers of color I do get appalling abuse, but you know, I've never suffered racism, as I need to keep, you know, which is something people like me need to remind ourselves of.
Okay, just to open this up to the audience at home.
Yeah.
Question is, do we have a responsibility now today to pay back in terms of compensation?
Well, I do go into this in the book, and I was in Jamaica as well, across the Caribbean, as some of you will know, that there has been a call for talk about reparative justice, reparations to begin, and Britain has ignored that call for talks. Some countries, Denmark, France, have not, and are talking. I asked a lot of people in the Caribbean about, again, of different sort of, you know, whether they thought reparations. I think we need to remember that the word reparations comes from repair, you know, and it's not just about money. I mean, the CARICOM nation's call was for a 10-point plan, and it's about education and technology transfer and debt forgiveness, and, you know, perhaps sharing a little more of the great wealth that this country still has compared with those countries that we exploited to become wealthy, India included. But people said, so again, you know, I try to ask people what they think rather than say what I think more and more. But so people in the Caribbean generally said to me, okay, you know, reparations is good. It seems to have worked between Germany and Israel, the Jewish people, after the Second World War, who are now countries that are at peace with each other. And this is an event that only happened 100 years after the end of slavery. So, and I think there is an analogy there. But I mean, a lot of people said, don't give the money to my government, which is kind of what I'd say if reparations are being paid to the Tory government here. And a lot of people, you know, pointed out quite rightly, how do you possibly do the sums? I mean, 250 years of shipping African people into slavery, all their descendants, who, as I said, names we will never know. I mean, my family and some others are giving token amounts to various charities in London, in the UK, and in the Caribbean. For, you know, and more families are joining us, which is great. But it's only a token. How could you possibly, 13 million people shipped by the British, all their descendants, how do you quantify that? You know, the damage, the neglect in the post-slavery period as well. So I think it's very hard, but I think, you know, we haven't apologized. And that's the other thing people said to me, is an apology would be nice. We've never apologized for slavery. We don't have a memorial to the victims of slavery in Britain. We have lots of memorials, but not that one. So I think there's an awful lot to be talked about and done. Talking is good.
Okay, we've got another one from the chat. So Writing Blood Legacy must have been a personal journey and full of self-reflection. Although there is a need and necessity to teach about the history of slavery more broadly, to what extent is there also a need for us to explore our own personal attitudes as a way to move forward to a place of reckoning? And do you have any advice of how we reach this place of self-reflection and how we might encourage that through education?
Wow. I mean, great principles. I mean, I can only agree. Do I have advice? I don't know. I mean, I think, I think it's interesting. I mean, I was talking to, so I'm a part of a big family. I've got lots of cousins, and we're all quite friendly, and and then all of us have kind of been through a journey with this history and publishing the book. And and I've got, there are a couple of people in my family, older people, who are really angry about it. But most of say about 30 people are really pleased that it's out, and it's not comfortable, it's not great, but I mean, one of them wrote to me the other day saying, I am happier now that I know I no longer have to think about how to handle this. I know how we're going to handle this, and that being open and honest is the way forward. So, I mean, maybe that's just it. Secret. I mean, as a journalist, I'm pretty anti-secrets. I mean, and it's been my job for 40 years to try and expose them. But I do have a belief in shining the light of truth on things. And certainly that on this story, and this, it's not guilt, but this shame that my family have carried for 200 years, we're in a better place because we've come out and said we're sorry. But again, that's because of our privilege. We're able to do that. There's nothing for people who are carrying the trauma of what happened to their ancestors on those plantations. That's not, there isn't a redemption there for them. And that's something I really did hear in Jamaica and Tobago. And it's why so many people talk of repatriation to Africa as the only way forward, to leave this place soaked with blood and horror. So yeah, but honesty is good.
And then an interesting question from the audience at home is, can racism today be fully blamed on the actions of our ancestors?
It's a really good one. I mean, and it's, the debate goes on and on. Are human beings naturally tribal, racist, whatever you like? And clearly that may be true. There's some historical research, or a lot of historical research around says that people of African origin race versus European racism doesn't appear to have existed in the pre-slavery societies. And I mean, there's arguments about this, but there a lot of work on it. But it doesn't appear largely to have existed. So I think I've bought the line because I have first-hand research, which is that race, Black African European racism is invented as part of the systems that permitted 10 European nations to enslave people, even though that wasn't possible for Christians. So that I accept. In other forms of, I mean, it's perfectly clear. I've been lucky enough to travel the world a lot as through my work as a foreign correspondent, and again reporting post-colonial conflict. You see where the British or the French colonial powers set one group against each other. I mean, Rwanda and the Tutsi group and the Hutu group, is part of, just administrative control. So the system, but you can see it all across East Africa as well. I mean, Satnam Sanghera talks about how in this preference the British colonialists expressed for the Sikh religion before other religions, because more trustworthy or more noble or more all inventions. This again, if you need to rule as Britain certainly did in the Caribbean colonies and in India, rule with a very few people you can trust because they're of your own ethnic group, setting other ethnic groups against each other and profiting from their warring is a really good way of doing it. So yeah, I'm pretty comfortable that a lot of that racism today has much of its roots in the practices of empire. but it's complex.
And so I guess a more broad question now. Do you think that the conversation regarding slavery and then more broadly the British Empire is moving in the right direction? Like, have you seen a encouraging trend? Or
yeah. What do you think, Tom? You've lived through the Black Lives Matter period. You know, I mean, you were only a year and a half ago.
I mean, it would be nice to say that there's been a trend, but I'm not convinced that that's, well, there's definitely not universal. I mean, just look at social media. And then obviously, I've not experienced it, but I've seen in the past year or so, friends of mine have experienced racism of all sorts. So I think, I don't know, it's hard to say.
I
would say it is moving in the right direction, but there's still quite a long way to go. And I don't think we'll ever reach kind of a universal consensus opinion on the empire. And it's always been quite contentious, I think, but it's important to keep having these difficult conversations.
Yeah.
And as you've had to go through the difficult experience of looking at your past, I think everyone has to do a similar-ish sort of thing if they can, and talk to people about it honestly and quite frankly. I think, even though I'm not a fan of kind of the divisive conversations in the media between different left and right, I think it's quite important to have those conversations. So I think that's a promising sign in some ways.
No, I certainly agree. I agree with that, and I think, you know, for you know, when the mainstream media became aware of Black Lives Matter, which of course is a movement that goes back some years, at the time of the death of George Floyd, and then we had the Colston statue event in Bristol. I mean, that was, you know, for me, who's, you know, that supercharged the debate, and I don't think we yet can see whether what the end effect of it is. But I think it seems to me as an observer that what had been really quite stuck discussion about race and history, about today's racism and inequality, because I think the two go side by side, was suddenly given enormous energy by what happened by the death of George Floyd and the activism that came as a result of that, and that still flows, and that's got to be good. But then equally, we almost, particularly in sport recently, we've seen more and more awful examples of of endemic racism, that but maybe we wouldn't have seen them if what had happened in June 2020 hadn't happened. So things are coming up. So I just, like you, I just don't know. I don't know. I asked Colson Whitehead. Do you know Colson Whitehead? He's a rather great American novelist who writes about slavery. Brilliant novelist. And I saw him at a book festival a couple of years ago, and I said, when do you think black and white racism ends? And he went, when the aliens land. and I then took it back again. That's too depressing. But you kind of see what he's saying. Maybe humanity needs another, but that is the negative view. I like to be more hopeful.
Sheldon asks, do you actually believe that Great Britain deserves to be called great? Because for him, he says, for most of my young years as a young black individual in this country, I find it quite hard to see.
It's a rubbish name, isn't it? I mean, but we know that, it doesn't refer to it being a good place. It refers to it being bigger than Little Britain, which is not the TV show, but Brittany in France. I think it's a rubbish name for a country, because it confuses and misleads people. It's, I live in Scotland, where we're currently discussing leaving your bit of the United Kingdom, the rest of the United Kingdom, and I think part of that is, we were very involved in slavery here as much as there, but there's something not healthy about Britain's larger attitudes to itself and to the world at the moment, I suspect. And maybe removing great would be one way of, and saying ordinary Britain would be a way of starting it. We need to shake it up, I think.
So we've got a question from Benjamin here, which is,
Right.
why do we still glorify slave traders in public places? Why do we name public places after them? Why are they glorified in our cathedrals and places of worship?
Benjamin, you're absolutely right. I mean, I would take. I mean, you know, I'm not an automatic statue and plaque and memorial remover. I kind of think it depends on the people who have to see or use the places every day. But if they want it, I would back them to take stuff down, put better stuff up, more relevant stuff up, if that's how they feel. I think it should be democratic. Well, no, it shouldn't be democratic. It needs not to cause offence. I know someone in Bristol, a woman of colour who became mayor of Bristol, actually, and who said to me, you know, I every day of my life from 13, I had to walk into the Colston Girls' School in Bristol, comprehensive in Bristol. You know, I mean, and I knew at 13 why it was called Colston, and this man had shipped 80,000 people, possibly my own great-great-great-great-grandmother, to Africa in slavery. And I think her view comes first on that. I mean, I think we've had this debate in Edinburgh. The biggest, I don't know if any of you know Edinburgh, the sort of Nelson's Column of Edinburgh in St Andrew's Square is a monument to Henry Dundas, who was a great supporter of the slave trade as a politician. And we've argued about it, and in the end we put a much bigger, better plaque up, and he stayed up there. That's good. You know, now the whole story's there. But if someone said we should take him down, I would listen.
Okay, I think that might have been our last question. Sorry for not being able to answer them all, but I'd like to say a big thank you to Alex for really engaging and informative talk.
Can I say one thing just before you thank you?
Sure.
Thank you for your great questions, everyone. So the book has a website, bloodlegacybook.com. All profits from the book are going to the charities I mentioned. Details of those charities are on a page called Reparations on the website. And if anyone wants to suggest a good cause, a charitable enterprise in the Caribbean or in Britain, you know, please contact me on the website and contact me about anything else. If you want to see my family's awful papers, I will send you the transcripts of them, because I think they should be for everybody. Bloodlegacybook.com.
Yep, highly recommend the book to anyone.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah.